Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a world that's as old as the Roman Empire itself, the life of a Roman prostitute. Now, before you get all squirmy, imagine this. A bustling street corner in ancient Rome, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and the chatter of market vendors. The sun is setting, casting long shadows over the forum, and in the quieter backstreets, behind the high walls of some unassuming buildings, an entirely different kind of business is thriving. Prostitutes, both enslaved people and free women, are earning their daily bread in ways that would make even the most modern entrepreneur blush. You probably won't survive this world, not with all those political intrigues, moral complexities, and, well, let's say things were a bit different back then. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's explore the extent to which the Roman Empire's influence remains today. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The world of Roman prostitutes is often misunderstood. It wasn't just about the women standing in darkened corners, waiting for some random Roman senator to stroll by. No. It was much more deeply ingrained in the fabric of Roman society than you might expect. Prostitution was legal, yes, you heard that right. The empire was so vast, encompassing numerous diverse cultures, that some practices considered shady today were simply part of daily life. Sex work wasn't seen as a crime, but as a legitimate part of the social structure. Historians still debate whether this lenient view was due to Rome's commitment to order and regulation, or if it had more to do with the sheer necessity of managing the massive and diverse population. Either way, sex work flourished in ancient Rome, and it was deeply ingrained in both public and private life. But let's take a moment to paint the picture more vividly. Picture yourself walking through the crowded streets of ancient Rome. The Colosseum looms in the distance, but down this side street, near the Subura district, you can smell the faint scent of incense mixed with the earthy aroma of wine. The sounds of merchants haggling and children playing are drowned out by the occasional loud shout from inside a brothel. It's here that women, many of whom were slaves, worked alongside free women, each in their niche. While the public perception of these women wasn't always positive, they were far from invisible. Prostitutes weren't relegated to the margins of society. They played a significant role in both the public and private spheres. They were seen everywhere, in the market squares, in the taverns, and even in the homes of wealthy patrons. The most famous of them, the high-class courtesans, enjoyed a lifestyle that, in many ways, mirrored that of the elite, moving in the same circles as politicians, generals, and emperors. These women weren't the lowly figures we often imagine when we think of prostitutes. No, these women had power and influence, though, of course, they weren't entirely free of societal judgment. Roman society, in all its complexity, was built on the premise of balancing order and chaos. That balance is reflected in how sex work was approached. On the one hand, prostitution was necessary for maintaining social order. On the other hand, it was considered morally questionable, a reflection of the empire's broader struggle between civilization and its chaotic impulses. That's why it was officially regulated. Brothels had to be licensed by the government, and prostitutes had to register with the authorities. Historians still debate the true motivations behind this regulation. Some suggest it was purely for practical reasons, ensuring that the business didn't spiral out of control. Others believe it was part of a larger moral strategy. Romans saw prostitution as a way to keep the chaos of sexuality contained, preventing it from disrupting the more respectable parts of society. In a way, sex work was kept in a controlled environment, with rules that were as much about managing public behavior as they were about generating tax revenue. Let's shift gears. Picture yourself as one of these women. You walk into a brothel, perhaps the one owned by an influential madam. You've already done your work for the day in the marketplace, and now this is your second job, so to speak. The brothel's walls are adorned with murals, and the air is thick with the smell of incense and sweat. The men who come through the doors are a variety of social classes. From senators to commoners, from soldiers to poets. They all come for one reason, and it's understood that their time here is private. The work is grueling. You're not just there to satisfy your client's physical needs. You're expected to engage in conversation, to provide companionship, to be an entertainer. Roman prostitutes, especially those who worked in high-end establishments, often had to be literate and well-versed in various topics, literature, philosophy, and politics. A courtesan was not just a body. She was a confidant, a sounding board, and, in some cases, even a muse. But despite the glamour that the most famous courtesans enjoyed, the life of a prostitute was not always as luxurious as it seems. In the lower-tier brothels, the women were often little more than enslaved people, forced to work long hours for little pay. Many were captured in wars or bought and sold as property. For them, the life of a prostitute was not a choice but a brutal necessity. There's an irony here, though. Despite their marginalized status, prostitutes had a certain amount of agency, certainly more than the enslaved people who worked for them. Prostitutes could negotiate their prices, choose their clients, and in some cases even purchase their freedom. But these freedoms came with a cost. Roman society, with its extensive regulation and control, was a place where personal liberty frequently clashed with social expectations. Let's continue our exploration of the intriguing world of Roman prostitution. It's not just a simple tale of an underground industry. It's a complex system that was not only legalized but also organized in a way that would make some modern businesses envious. These were not just shady establishments, they were legitimate businesses with their own rules, management, and even unique branding. It's almost as if they were ancient Rome's version of high-end service providers, with a twist most wouldn't want to experience. We're talking about brothels that ranged from basic establishments, where lower-class prostitutes worked, to opulent, elite houses with patrons that came from all walks of Roman life. There were no standards for what made a brothel good or bad in terms of decor or cleanliness. However, a system was in place to ensure the business ran smoothly. Brothels were taxed and required to be licensed, much like modern businesses today. Imagine that, a brothel with a business license. Can you picture a modern-day entrepreneur applying for a license to operate a brothel in the same way you'd apply for a permit to open a restaurant or a shop? What's interesting is that, despite prostitution's status as an official business, Roman brothels were still surrounded by layers of secrecy. There was a kind of duality at play here. Prostitution was accepted but kept out of sight from the more respectable parts of society. The elite class enjoyed the benefits of the brothels but didn't necessarily want their involvement known. This is why many brothels were located in parts of the city that were a little more out of sight from the public eye, yet not completely hidden. Some of these brothels were situated in high-traffic areas, such as marketplaces, but their entranceways were deliberately understated to maintain a sense of mystery and exclusivity. These brothels were not just places for physical pleasure. They were hubs of entertainment, conversation, and even philosophical discussions. Yes, some of the most intellectual Romans would engage with prostitutes in deep discussions about literature, politics, and even the latest plays in the theater. These women were not just there to provide physical pleasure. They were expected to be well-rounded, well-read, and able to keep their clients entertained beyond the physical act. In many ways, Roman prostitutes had more in common with modern-day hostesses than with what we usually think of when we hear the word prostitute. Historians still debate whether all women in the trade expected this intellectual side of the job or whether it was mostly reserved for the upper-class courtesans. However, what is clear is that these women had to be multifaceted. Many learned to speak several languages, enabling them to cater to foreign clients visiting Rome for business or pleasure. They also needed to understand how to interact with all kinds of people, whether it was a general, a poet, or a local baker. Meanwhile, for those women who worked in lower-tier brothels, the situation was much different. These brothels were far less glamorous. They were grimy and often overcrowded, catering to soldiers and lower-class men who needed an outlet for their desires. These prostitutes had far less autonomy and worked under much harsher conditions. They were less likely to engage in intellectual conversations with their clients. Instead, they were there to fulfill a more basic role. For these women, sex work was a daily grind, often dangerous, often dehumanizing, but essential for survival in the economic reality of the Roman lower class. The disparity between high-end and low-end brothels was stark. While the elite brothels were luxurious, with fine clothing, jewelry, and even lavish furnishings, the lower-tier establishments offered little in terms of comfort or security. These women might have earned less and lived in less-than-ideal conditions, but their work was still considered essential. Roman society had an obvious hierarchy, and prostitutes, especially those who worked in the lower-end brothels, occupied the lowest rungs. They were seen as an unfortunate necessity, not quite the social outcasts of some cultures, but certainly not among the respected classes. But don't be fooled by the romanticized picture of the high-class courtesan. Life in the brothel, regardless of class, came with its own unique set of risks. While some of the elite courtesans might have enjoyed the benefits of luxury, such as fine clothing, jewelry, and even political influence, they were still under constant pressure to maintain their beauty, charm, and relevance. Failure to please the right people could result in falling out of favor, which, in the Roman Empire, could be a disaster. The stakes were high for everyone involved in the sex trade, whether they were at the top or bottom of the social ladder. Now, let's talk a little bit about the men who frequented these establishments. In ancient Rome, men of all social classes participated in the sex trade, but they weren't always keen on being associated with it. The aristocracy, for instance, might use the brothels but did so in secret. They could afford the privacy of having prostitutes brought to their homes or retreating to a private villa. The lower classes, on the other hand, had fewer options. They were less likely to have the same level of privacy or discretion, so they resorted to using public brothels more frequently. The relationship between men and the women they hired for sexual services was as complex as the relationship between men and women in Roman society in general. In Roman culture, sexual freedom for men was generally accepted, but women had far fewer rights in this regard. Women, particularly those from the upper classes, were expected to be chaste and reserved, while men were often praised for their conquests. Prostitutes, therefore, occupied a strange space. They were needed and yet shunned by mainstream society. Interestingly, while many women worked as prostitutes out of necessity or lack of options, others were there by choice, whether it was for financial independence or personal desire. Roman prostitution wasn't strictly about survival. It was also about agency, even within the constraints of the time. Historians still argue whether the level of agency that Roman prostitutes had is something we should admire or pity. Were they empowered women, making their own decisions in a society that didn't provide many opportunities for them, or were they victims of an oppressive system? This debate continues, but one thing is clear: Roman prostitutes, especially the higher-tier ones, were far more complex and influential than we often give them credit for. The life of a Roman prostitute wasn't easy, but it was also not as simple as some might think. These women possessed their sense of agency and were involved in a business that, although often perceived as morally dubious, was an integral part of Roman society. Roman prostitutes didn't just work in brothels. They also worked on the streets. It was a common sight to see women standing outside taverns or near busy market areas. They were there to offer their services to anyone willing to pay. The street-based prostitutes had a different experience compared to those working in the more regulated brothels. They had to deal with the elements and the dangers of being outside. Yet, for some, it offered more freedom. They weren't tied to one location and could move around the city, choosing when and where to work. Some preferred it because it allowed them to avoid the scrutiny of a brothel's management. However, this kind of freedom came with its risks. Street prostitutes had to be on constant alert. They often dealt with drunk men who didn't respect boundaries. It was dangerous, and many women didn't make enough money to escape the harsh conditions. Some were even forced into street work due to circumstances beyond their control. The streets of Rome were crowded, and many women worked in the shadows, trying to remain unnoticed. In a city with an estimated population of over 1 million, these women were an invisible yet essential part of daily life. In contrast, brothels offered some protection. The women working there were often under the control of a madam, who kept the brothel running smoothly. There was less risk of being harmed by clients or the general public. The brothel's owner ensured that the women worked in a controlled environment. They were expected to maintain specific standards. The brothel was like a business. The clients were aware of the price, the service, and the rules. The women didn't have to worry about negotiating their fees on the spot, as they did in street work. The brothel's pricing was set, and the management handled all client interactions. But not all brothels were the same. Some were grand, while others were shabby. A high-end brothel would look like a luxury hotel. The women in these brothels had access to fine clothes, cosmetics, and luxury items. They could have their rooms, eat well, and live a better life than most. They had a greater degree of independence compared to the women in the lower tier. These courtesans could even influence powerful men. Some of them were well known in Roman society, and their names were associated with the highest circles. Wealthy men, even emperors, could seek out these women for companionship beyond just physical satisfaction. These courtesans provided more than sex. They offered a form of escape, intellectual stimulation, and sometimes even political advice. The lower-class brothels, however, painted a different picture. The women here had little to no control over their lives. They lived in cramped rooms, worked long hours, and had few rights. The clients were often soldiers, enslaved people, and men from the lower classes. These brothels were dirty, overcrowded, and lacked any form of luxury. The women's lives were controlled by the madam or the establishment's owner. The pay was low and the work was grueling. These women had little time for anything other than work. The demands of the brothel consumed their lives, and their earnings were often spent on necessities rather than luxury. Yet, some women in the lower-tier brothels could rise above their circumstances. Some were clever enough to gain a loyal client base. They could save money and even buy their freedom. It was rare, but it did happen. However, most women in this position had to stay in the brothels for life. They were trapped by the system that had no way out for them. This was especially true for enslaved people who were forced into prostitution. Their chances of escape were almost non-existent, as they were legally owned by someone else. They had no agency and no real power in Roman society. In Roman society, prostitution was regulated by law. There were rules and regulations in place to control the practice. Brothels were required to be licensed, and the women working in them had to register with the authorities. Prostitutes were required to pay taxes on their earnings. In return, they were allowed to work openly. This gave the Roman state control over the practice. The state could monitor the brothels and ensure that the business ran smoothly. Prostitution was not something hidden in the shadows. It was a visible, accepted part of daily life. This regulation also made it easier for men to indulge in their desires without fear of retribution. It was a controlled and regulated business. Roman law also made distinctions between different types of sex work. Some prostitutes worked in brothels, those who worked independently, and enslaved people who were forced into prostitution. The law treated these groups differently. The women who worked in brothels were considered a legal part of society, whereas those who worked on the streets or were enslaved had fewer rights. Prostitutes in high-status brothels had more protection, whereas street-based workers faced more risks and less legal recognition. Some historians believe the state's regulation of prostitution helped prevent social chaos. By licensing brothels and taxing sex work, Rome was able to control the practice without having to eliminate it. It kept the practice out in the open, where it could be managed, rather than pushed into the shadows. Others argue that this system exploited women and trapped them in a cycle of poverty and control. They say the laws may have protected the Roman state's interests, but they did little to protect the women involved. Prostitution in ancient Rome was a business that served both practical and social purposes. While it allowed for a release of social tensions, it also reinforced gender and class inequalities. The wealthy and powerful men who enjoyed the services of prostitutes were free from the constraints of their society. They could indulge in their desires without fear of judgment or consequences. Meanwhile, the women who provided those services had to live with the societal stigma attached to their work. Historians continue to debate whether the system ultimately benefited anyone. Was it a form of exploitation or a practical solution to the realities of ancient Roman life? While the answer may never be clear, it's undeniable that prostitution played a key role in Roman society. The women who worked in the brothels and on the streets of Rome were part of an unspoken but very real system that shaped the empire. Whether they were at the top or bottom of the social ladder, these women had to navigate a world full of contradictions. A world where sex was a commodity, but so too were beauty, intelligence, and the ability to entertain. And, as you lie there, drifting off to sleep, think about these women. Think about their lives, about the choices they made, the freedom they had, and the limitations they lived within. It's easy to overlook them, but they were part of a larger world. One that, like so many others in history, is often forgotten but incredibly important to understanding the past. Now that we've delved into the daily grind of Roman prostitutes and the stark contrasts between brothels, let's take a closer look at the real stars of the sex trade, the high-class courtesans. These women, often regarded as both entertainment and intellectual companions, led lives that were as luxurious as they were complex. These courtesans were not just hired for their physical beauty. They were valued for their wit, charm, and ability to hold a conversation with the most powerful men in Rome. And when I say powerful, I mean emperors, senators, generals, and philosophers. These women had influence. They could shape conversations, influence decisions, and, at times, even push the limits of Roman politics. The life of a high-class courtesan was one of contrasts. On the one hand, they had wealth and privilege. They were dressed in the finest silks, adorned with jewelry, and often had access to the best food and drink that Rome had to offer. These women moved in elite circles, attending lavish banquets and socializing with men who could make or break their careers. Many courtesans had their private villas or apartments, where they could entertain their clients in comfort and privacy. For them, the brothel was no longer a requirement. They were sought after by the highest bidder, and the luxury of their lifestyle was the envy of many. However, this life of luxury didn't come without its pressures. Being a high-class courtesan wasn't about looking beautiful. It was about maintaining that beauty, charm, and intellect at all times. In a society obsessed with youth and appearance, staying relevant was no small task. The pressure to remain desirable was constant. Aging, for these women, was a form of currency lost. Once their beauty faded, so too did their influence and ability to command high prices. Many high-status prostitutes, though wealthy, would eventually face the harsh reality of their fading allure, often being replaced by younger, fresher faces. It wasn't all glamour, though. Courtesans often walked a fine line between power and exploitation. They could be pawns in the games of powerful men. They had access to the elite, but they weren't always seen as equals. Despite their influence, courtesans were often still marginalized by Roman society. They may have been sought after for their companionship, but they were still seen as little more than commodities. The male clients, while appreciative of their charm and intellect, rarely acknowledged them as anything other than their paid companions. The women who entertained them were part of a system that commodified their bodies, their minds, and their entire existence. But let's take a moment to think about one of these women. Picture her walking through the grand streets of Rome, her silken dress flowing behind her. As the city bustles with life, she enters a lavish villa, where she's greeted with a fine meal and offered the best wine. She's accompanied by a group of powerful men, all eager for her company. Conversations range from politics to philosophy, and she plays her part with grace and poise, engaging with each of them on their level. She's more than just a pretty face. She's intelligent, cultured, and aware of the power she holds. Her beauty, combined with her sharp mind, has earned her a place in society's highest circles. However, despite her high status, there's a darker side to her existence. She may have wealth, but she doesn't have the traditional sense of freedom. Her relationships are transactional, even with the men who seem to admire her. She knows that her position in society is fragile, dependent on her looks, charm, and, at times, her ability to manipulate those around her. She may be sought after today, but how long will it last? The reality of her life as a courtesan is a balancing act between power and vulnerability. In some cases, these women could become quite wealthy and independent. A few even amassed enough fortune to buy their freedom or retire from the business entirely. Yet, the majority of courtesans lived within the confines of their role, always working to maintain their influence and lifestyle. The difference between high and low status prostitutes wasn't just about the money, they had a different kind of power. It wasn't just about selling sex. It was about selling influence, charm, and intellect. These women often had no choice but to adapt to the Roman expectations of them, which demanded both sexual and intellectual offerings. While many women were born into prostitution, others sought it as a way out of poverty or to gain social status. Some women even found a measure of independence through their work as courtesans, earning a degree of financial security that was otherwise unavailable to women in ancient Rome. But again, it came with the price of being viewed as little more than an accessory to powerful men. The elite courtesans had to balance their power with the political realities of Roman society. These women were well aware of the delicate line they walked. They had to keep their clients happy while also preserving their sense of dignity and control. Many were keenly aware of their position in society and the fleeting nature of their careers. It wasn't unusual for a courtesan to become a confidant for powerful men, offering more than just pleasure, but advice, and even taking part in political schemes or decisions. Historians still debate whether the position of these courtesans was empowering or exploitative. Some argue that these women were among the few who had any personal power in a male-dominated society. They could command the attention of the highest men in Rome, influencing political decisions and social norms. Others, however, believe that despite their apparent agency, these women were still fundamentally exploited, used by the very men they were meant to impress. No matter how much power they had, they were still working within the constraints of Roman societal norms that viewed them as little more than entertainers. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those women, the courtesans who held the attention of Rome's most powerful men. Imagine the conversations they had, the stories they told, and the power they wielded. Despite their challenges, their position in Roman society was one of significant influence, albeit with limitations. For them, survival wasn't just about pleasing clients. It was about maintaining a delicate balance of power and survival in a world that was as beautiful as it was brutal. Let's shift focus now. While Roman prostitutes and courtesans were the stars of the trade, they were not the only women involved in the world of sex work. Enslaved people who had little to no autonomy also found themselves thrust into prostitution, often against their will. These women, in particular, led harrowing lives that were marked by exploitation. Their stories are a tragic reminder of how deep and dark the Roman system of slavery ran. While many Roman prostitutes were free, the majority of women in the sex trade were slaves. These women had no choice in the matter. Enslaved people were often captured in wars or sold into servitude by their families due to poverty. They were considered property, owned by their masters, who could do as they pleased with them. If a master wanted to sell an enslaved woman to a brothel or force her into prostitution, there was no law or regulation to stop it. This was seen as a part of their role. It was not just about sex. These women were often forced to perform in public displays, catering to the whims of their owners or the men who rented them. They had no say in their bodies. Historians still argue whether the practice of forcing enslaved people into prostitution was a form of systemic abuse or a necessary evil within the economic framework of the Roman Empire. Some believe it was a calculated decision made by enslavers to exploit their human property for profit. In contrast, others argue that it was simply a natural consequence of the way the Romans treated women and enslaved people in general. The life of a slave prostitute was one of constant submission and exhaustion. These women worked from dawn until late at night. They had no rest, no respite, and no privacy. It's hard to imagine what these women must have felt. Enslaved people had no rights, no personal freedom. Their bodies were simply tools for their masters to profit from, whether through labor, sexual service, or any other means. But even in this harsh environment, some managed to survive. Some enslaved people, through sheer force of will or luck, managed to buy their freedom. This was rare, but it wasn't impossible. In some instances, a slave prostitute could accumulate enough wealth to bribe her way out of servitude. It wasn't uncommon for an enslaved person to save money earned through prostitution, either to purchase their freedom or escape their owner's control. Once freed, they could continue working as an independent prostitute, though the stigma of their past would remain. In some cases, the demand for slave prostitutes came from the elite classes, who could afford the luxury of hiring women from the highest-tier brothels. These women were seen as more exotic or desirable because of their status as enslaved people. The elite loved the thrill of purchasing someone who had no power, someone they could dominate fully. Yet, this demand also fueled the business of slave brothels, where these women were forced to work. These women often had to bear the brunt of a life spent as both sexual commodities and legal property. While the free women in brothels had a difficult time, at least they were somewhat protected by the system. They could make money, buy their freedom, and lead relatively independent lives. Not so for the enslaved people. For them, prostitution wasn't a profession. It was a fate. It was a part of their service, dictated by their masters with no way out. But let's take a moment to recognize the resilience of some of these women. Despite the immense challenges they faced, there were instances where an enslaved person, even in the lowest form of prostitution, could find a path to power. Some even gained enough status within the system to become madams themselves, running their brothels and hiring both free and enslaved women. In such cases, the lines between enslaved persons and free people became blurred. These women had risen from the depths of servitude to manage their businesses, essentially becoming a part of the very system that had once oppressed them. While their story isn't one of complete liberation, it is one of survival against all odds. However, most enslaved people had no such opportunity. They remained bound to their masters, unable to control their bodies or their futures. They lived a life in constant servitude, working long hours for little or no pay. Even the women who had been freed were still stigmatized by their past, making it difficult to escape the world of prostitution. They were never entirely accepted into Roman society and had to live in its shadows. Slavery in ancient Rome was a brutal system, and it's impossible to understand the depth of that system without acknowledging the role sex work played in it. The use of enslaved people for prostitution wasn't just an afterthought, it was built into the very fabric of Roman society. It was a means of controlling women, exploiting their bodies for profit, and maintaining a structure of dominance. This brings us to a disturbing truth about Roman prostitution. Even though it was regulated by law and, in many cases, even respected in society, it was still rooted in deep systemic inequality. While some women had the agency to make decisions, most had no choice at all. Their bodies were not their own, and their survival depended entirely on the whims of the men who owned them. In the eyes of Roman law, women were often reduced to their bodies, to what they could provide for the men who controlled them. This wasn't just a practice for those at the bottom of society, it was woven into the fabric of the empire itself. As you settle in for the night, think about the women who were forced into this life. They were enslaved, living under the harshest conditions imaginable. They didn't have the freedom to choose their path. They lived a life of oppression and exploitation, but somehow, some of them found ways to survive. And perhaps, in their quiet way, they fought for their right to be free, even if it meant buying their way out of the system that controlled them. As we delve into the world of Roman prostitutes, it's intriguing to discover the unexpected role of religion in this complex landscape. The intertwining of prostitution and religion in ancient Rome, a society filled with rituals and gods concerned not only with the state, but also with private aspects of daily life like sex, is a revelation that might surprise you. For instance, the goddess Venus was the Roman deity of love, sex, and fertility. Venus was a prominent figure in the Roman pantheon, and her worship was deeply entwined with the practices of the sex trade. Many prostitutes were said to honor Venus as a way to secure good fortune in their profession. While prostitution was legally regulated, it was also steeped in religious practice, with prostitutes turning to the gods for blessings and protection in their work. Many brothels had altars dedicated to Venus, and women would offer prayers to her, hoping for a prosperous day or protection from harm. Venus wasn't the only deity tied to sex work in Roman society. There were several gods and goddesses whose domains overlapped with prostitution in one way or another. Priapus, for example, was a fertility god associated with male sexuality and the protection of gardens. His statues, which were often depicted with exaggerated genitalia, were placed outside brothels as a form of protection and to ward off evil spirits. Prostitutes would sometimes make offerings to Priapus, seeking his favor in their work. Interestingly, the image of Priapus, with his oversized and prominent features, served not only as a symbol of fertility but also as a talisman for sexual prowess. The most intriguing aspect of the religious connection to prostitution was the concept of sacred prostitution, a practice that historians have debated for years. The idea that some women in ancient Rome might have worked as prostitutes in temples, in direct service to the gods, is a topic of heated discussion. In these cases, the act of sex was believed to be a form of worship, a way to appease the gods and ensure fertility for the land and people. The most famous example of this practice comes from the Temple of Venus in Rome, where it was rumored that some women would have sex with clients as part of a religious ritual. The debate continues, with historians arguing over whether this was a widespread practice or an invention of later writers trying to add a layer of mystique to the sex trade. Though the exact details of sacred prostitution in ancient Rome remain unclear, what is certain is that religion played a pivotal role in shaping how sex work was perceived. Prostitutes were not seen as purely secular figures. They were often integrated into the religious and social fabric of Roman life, a fact that underscores the complexity of Roman society. This connection helped create a somewhat paradoxical view of prostitution in Roman society. On the one hand, prostitutes were marginalized and often looked down upon. On the other hand, they were seen as part of a divine order, with specific rituals and deities dedicated to their work. Understanding the role of religion in shaping societal perceptions of sex work is a key aspect of understanding the dynamics of ancient Roman society. The role of religion in Roman prostitution also extended beyond the temples. Many brothels, especially those catering to the wealthier classes, had religious altars and symbols adorning their interiors. These symbols were not just for protection. They were also a reminder that the act of sex wasn't just about physical pleasure. It was also about divine forces. In a way, the religious aspect of Roman prostitution allowed women in the trade to feel a sense of connection to something greater than themselves. Even amid their complex and often dangerous work, they were part of a broader cosmic order. But while many women in the sex trade used religion to navigate their role in Roman society, some fought against this system. Some historians argue that prostitution was a form of rebellion in a profoundly patriarchal society. The act of selling sex, even if it was forced or coerced, allowed women to exert some control over their bodies. They might not have had political or economic power, but they could control their clients' desires. In this way, prostitution was a form of subversive agency. The women who worked in brothels were both marginalized and empowered by the system in which they worked, a testament to their resilience and resourcefulness. The religious connection also serves as a reminder that the Roman Empire was a place where moral lines were often blurred. The same society that celebrated virtue and chastity also celebrated Venus and Priapus, gods who embodied the opposite of restraint. This duality, this complex interplay of virtue and vice, helped shape the way prostitution was treated. It was at once a necessary part of Roman life and something that needed to be hidden or controlled. The state and society acknowledged prostitutes, but they were also relegated to the margins, constantly balancing between divine approval and social disgrace. The complexity of Roman society, with its conflicting values and societal norms, is a fascinating aspect of history that continues to intrigue us today. As you reflect on the world of Roman prostitutes tonight, consider the profound empowerment they derived from their religious practices. Their connection to Venus and Priapus wasn't just about offering prayers for better clients. It was about finding meaning and power in an otherwise disempowered position. The religious practices surrounding prostitution in ancient Rome may seem strange to us today. Still, they were a way for women in the sex trade to negotiate their place in a complex, often hostile society. They found ways to make sense of their world by turning to the gods. In this strange and paradoxical world, they were both revered and reviled, sacred and profane. Now that we've delved into the role of religion in Roman prostitution, let's shift our focus to the diverse clientele. In Roman society, the patrons of prostitutes were a diverse group, ranging from emperors to soldiers and from senators to merchants. Prostitution, it seems, was an institution that transcended social class. Many of the most powerful men in Rome sought the services of prostitutes, whether to maintain their status or to relieve the pressures of their positions. But what drove these men to the brothels, despite the potential for scandal or criticism? For the wealthy, the brothel was a private escape from the duties of leadership and public life. Roman senators and patricians, often expected to uphold a sense of honor and virtue, could indulge their desires in the safety of a brothel, where their anonymity was guaranteed. While their public lives were centered on politics and law, their private lives were often filled with indulgence. Prostitutes, especially the high-class courtesans, were not just a means of pleasure but also intellectual companions. These men would frequently engage in philosophical debates or political discussions with the women they paid, seeing them as more than just objects of desire. The life of a senator or high-ranking official in ancient Rome was a stressful one. Political life was cutthroat, filled with intrigue, competition, and constant maneuvering for power. For many men, the brothel was a place to escape the burdens of public life. By seeking the company of a courtesan, they could retreat into a world of privacy and indulgence. The courtesan, in turn, played the role of both lover and confidant, providing an outlet for the tensions of a powerful man's existence. For soldiers and men of the lower classes, brothels served a different purpose. Life for a soldier was arduous and often brutal. They endured long periods, sometimes years, away from home, engaged in battles in distant lands. Upon their return to Rome, they frequently sought solace in the arms of a prostitute as a means to cope with the harsh realities of their work. Many soldiers did not have the luxury of high-class brothels. Instead, they frequented the more basic establishments. These brothels were rough and impersonal, but they offered something essential: a temporary escape from the hardships of military life. While prostitutes catered to the physical needs of men, there was also an element of performance involved. The prostitutes of ancient Rome were not just fulfilling a need for sex. They were providing an experience. For many men, it was an opportunity to escape their daily lives and experience something exotic, different, or forbidden. Roman prostitutes, particularly those in the elite brothels, were expected to entertain their clients with more than just their bodies. They were often expected to engage in witty conversation, play musical instruments, or even tell stories. Some courtesans were even trained in art, literature, or philosophy, becoming intellectual companions to their clients. Despite the wealth and luxury associated with the high-class prostitutes, there was a stark divide between how men of different classes viewed the trade. For the elite, Prostitution was often a way to indulge in pleasure without consequence. For the lower classes, however, it was more about necessity than luxury. Soldiers, laborers, and enslaved people, who made up the majority of the Roman population, turned to the brothels not out of desire for companionship or luxury, but because it was often their only option for sexual release. Roman law was clear on the issue of prostitution. It was legal and regulated, but only under specific circumstances. Brothels were required to be licensed, and their operations were closely monitored. However, these laws did little to protect the women involved. Prostitutes were often subjected to the whims of their clients and were rarely afforded the same legal protections as other citizens. It wasn't uncommon for prostitutes to be treated as little more than property, with no rights to their bodies or livelihoods. Despite the legal protections afforded to brothels, many women were still vulnerable to exploitation. The women in lower-tier brothels were especially at risk, as they often had little recourse if clients or owners mistreated them. Prostitutes were frequently seen as disposable commodities. They were usually replaced with younger, more attractive women as they aged, and their clients moved on to the next conquest. For these women, their lives were a constant cycle of selling their bodies, earning a living, and hoping for a better life. This perception of women as disposable was deeply ingrained in Roman society. Prostitutes, regardless of their status, were still considered inferior. Even high-class courtesans, who led relatively comfortable lives, were viewed with suspicion. They were admired for their beauty and intellect, but they were still not seen as true equals. The Roman elite, while eager to partake in their services, rarely regarded prostitutes as individuals deserving of the same rights and respect as other women. Still, some courtesans managed to break through these societal barriers. Many courtesans formed close relationships with powerful men, sometimes becoming their trusted confidants and even influencing decisions of great importance. Some were able to amass significant wealth and power, using their status as a way to maneuver through Roman society. But even these women were rarely entirely accepted into the social circles they had infiltrated. As you drift off tonight, consider the complexities of these relationships. The men who sought out prostitutes in ancient Rome were not just fulfilling a physical need. They were engaging in a complex dance of power, prestige, and desire. Whether they were senators or soldiers, their interactions with prostitutes reflect a deeper, sometimes darker, aspect of Roman society. While the prostitutes themselves were often marginalized, they held a unique power, one that was paradoxically both empowering and exploitative. These women, whether they were high-status courtesans or street workers, navigated a world full of contradictions, where their bodies were used for pleasure. Still, their minds and their personalities were equally crucial to the men who sought them. Now that we've touched on the world of the men who frequented brothels, let's delve into one of the most misunderstood and fascinating aspects of Roman prostitution: the role of women who worked independently. While many women were confined to brothels and treated as property by their masters or madams, some women worked on their terms, outside the established brothel system. These women, often called independent prostitutes, had more autonomy and could set their prices and schedules. But this didn't mean their lives were easy or free from danger. Independent prostitutes in ancient Rome were more likely to work in public spaces, such as the streets or markets. They didn't have the protection of a brothel, and many were subject to harassment and violence. But they also had more flexibility in their work, which made the life of an independent prostitute an interesting mixture of freedom and risk. Some of these women might have worked from their homes or rented rooms, but others set up shop in the streets, near busy areas where the flow of men was constant. Roman roads were often filled with people, and these women used their visibility to attract customers. However, this visibility was a double-edged sword. While the street offered opportunities to attract new clients, it also exposed these women to danger. They had no formal protection, and their status as free agents left them vulnerable to exploitation. Local authorities targeted many, and some were harassed or even assaulted by clients who knew they could get away with it. In a sense, independent prostitutes had a certain level of freedom, but they also faced much greater risks. Unlike those in brothels, they had no one to regulate their clients or ensure their safety. They were out there on their own, exposed to whatever might happen in the crowded streets of Rome. Despite the challenges they faced, some independent prostitutes were able to make a living for themselves. They had the freedom to negotiate prices with their clients and work as much or as little as they liked. Some even gained a certain level of independence, able to save money and eventually retire from the trade. But for most, life was precarious. The work was physically demanding, and the danger of being targeted or assaulted was constant. These women, despite their freedom, were still deeply tied to the realities of Roman society, which treated them with disdain, seeing them as little more than tools for men's pleasure. While many independent prostitutes were working class, some women with more wealth and social standing also took part in sex work. The reasons for this varied. Some may have pursued it for financial independence, while others might have been driven by the desire to control their bodies. Independent prostitutes often had a reputation for being more selective about their clients, and some even ran their small operations. However, even these women were still stigmatized. A woman's reputation was paramount in ancient Rome, and women who engaged in prostitution, whether independently or as part of a brothel, were seen as morally questionable. Interestingly, independent prostitutes were often treated differently from their counterparts in brothels. While brothel workers were seen as part of a formalized system, independent prostitutes had more room to shape their own lives. This sometimes meant they had more power over their situation. They could choose their clients, determine their working hours, and negotiate their pay. However, it also meant they had to manage all the risks and dangers that came with the job on their own. This contrast highlights a larger issue in Roman society: the limited agency of women. Even independent prostitutes were still subject to the overall societal structure that treated women as secondary citizens. They might have had more freedom than their counterparts in brothels, but they were still not fully in control of their lives. They worked within a system that ultimately regarded them as objects for male consumption. Whether in brothels or on the streets, their role in society was one of subordination. Despite these hardships, some independent prostitutes found ways to thrive. Many were savvy businesswomen, able to attract loyal clients who paid them well. They were often more strategic about their appearance and demeanor, knowing how to sell themselves to the men who passed by. Their skill in negotiating, managing their finances, and navigating the complex world of Roman sex work allowed them to carve out a degree of stability. In some cases, independent prostitutes were able to retire from the trade, either by saving enough money to buy land or starting new businesses altogether. Historians still debate whether independent prostitution was more empowering or more dangerous for women. Some believe that having control over one's body and livelihood could be seen as empowering in an otherwise oppressive society. Others argue that, because these women were still subject to the same societal judgment and exploitation, their independence didn't provide them with any lasting power. These women were still bound by the expectations and limitations placed on them by Roman society. But what about the women who weren't as successful? What about those who didn't have the autonomy or savvy to thrive on their own? For many, the reality was harsh. They were caught in a cycle of poverty, constantly struggling to make enough money to survive. Some of these women had to rely on clients who abused or exploited them. They had no backup plan, no real safety net. Their future was uncertain, and they lived in constant fear of being forgotten, discarded, or replaced by younger, more attractive women. Independent prostitutes might have had more freedom than those working in brothels, but their lives were often just as precarious. They were always at the mercy of a system that commodified their bodies and dictated their worth. And as we drift off to sleep tonight, think about the women who faced those realities. Some had the strength to survive. Others fell victim to the system. However, all of them lived lives shaped by forces beyond their control, their futures dictated by the whims of men and society. Now, let's explore the unusual and often overlooked aspect of Roman prostitution, the laws that governed it. While prostitution was an established part of Roman society, it wasn't entirely without regulation. The Roman Empire, known for its bureaucratic and structured approach to almost everything, had an obvious legal framework that shaped the sex trade. While many aspects of Roman life were left to personal discretion, prostitution was something the state felt the need to control, manage, and, most importantly, profit from. In Roman society, brothels were considered a business, and like any other business, they were subject to specific rules. Brothels were licensed by the government, which ensured they were taxed, monitored, and operated within the bounds of Roman law. The brothel owners, or lienons, had to register their establishments and pay taxes on their earnings. Prostitutes, too, had to be registered, and they were often required to pay a fee to work. This legal framework was designed not just to keep prostitution in check, but to make sure it was profitable for the Roman state. The regulation of prostitution in ancient Rome is an interesting case study in how the government balanced moral and economic interests. On the one hand, the state needed to maintain some level of control over this potentially disruptive and morally questionable practice. On the other hand, it was a primary source of income for the empire. The taxes generated by prostitution were significant, and the state was not willing to let such a profitable industry go unregulated. This legal framework also had a unique aspect. It placed responsibility on both the brothel owner and the prostitute. While the owner had the power to manage the business and control the women who worked for him, the prostitutes themselves had to adhere to the laws that governed their behavior. Prostitutes were expected to follow specific codes of conduct. For instance, they couldn't engage in any activities that would harm their clients or disrupt the business. They had to arrive on time, maintain a certain level of decorum, and adhere to the rules set by the brothel, such as serving a certain number of clients per day. While the regulation of prostitution was extensive, it wasn't designed to protect the prostitutes themselves. Prostitutes were still viewed as lesser members of society, and the law did little to ensure their safety or rights. They were treated as commodities, and their protection was secondary to maintaining the brothel's business operations. The women working in these establishments were still considered the property of their owners, and their ability to work was heavily controlled. Historians still argue about how much protection these laws afforded prostitutes. Some believe that the regulation of prostitution provided some level of security, ensuring that women working in brothels weren't subjected to the kind of arbitrary abuse that might have occurred in an unregulated environment. Others argue that the laws served to legitimize and formalize the exploitation of women. The state's focus was on maintaining order, not improving the conditions for the women involved. In contrast to brothels, some laws governed independent prostitutes. Independent prostitutes, who worked outside the brothel system, were treated differently under Roman law. They weren't required to register, and they weren't subject to the same taxes and regulations. However, this didn't mean they had more freedom. It often meant they were more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Without the protection of a licensed brothel, independent prostitutes were more likely to be mistreated by clients, harassed by authorities, or even forced off the streets by local officials. Roman law, while it acknowledged the existence of independent sex work, didn't offer any real protection for these women. While the state had a clear interest in regulating prostitution, it didn't necessarily enforce laws that protected the women involved. Prostitutes had few rights, and their status as citizens was minimal at best. They were required to follow the law, but the law rarely afforded them any protection from harm. Their ability to assert any power or claim justice was limited. They lived in a world that viewed them as expendable, and the laws were designed to keep them in their place, making sure they could be easily replaced when needed. This lack of legal protection is a stark reminder of the injustices these women faced. Despite the lack of legal protections, some women were able to gain a measure of control over their lives. A few managed to rise in status, either through their beauty or intellect, and became highly sought-after courtesans. These women, despite being prostitutes, gained power within Roman society. They could influence men, even emperors, and some even amassed significant wealth. But the vast majority of women in the trade had no such opportunities. They worked long hours for little pay, often at the mercy of their owners or clients. A constant struggle marked their lives as they fought for survival in a world that offered them few options for advancement. Even though prostitution was technically legal in ancient Rome, it was still viewed with moral disdain. Prostitutes were not considered respectable members of society, and many faced social stigma throughout their lives. Even those who managed to escape the brothels or retire from the profession still carried the label of prostitute with them. They were viewed as tainted, regardless of the wealth or power they had accumulated. This societal stigma, deeply ingrained in the fabric of Roman society, added another layer of hardship to the already challenging lives of these women. As you lie back tonight, think about how the law shaped the lives of Roman prostitutes. It's hard to imagine how these women navigated a system that treated them as commodities, regulated and controlled them, and yet mainly left them vulnerable to abuse. Despite their resilience, their lives were still dictated by laws that saw them as lesser citizens, bound to the will of the men they served. These women had little control over their fate, but in a society that sought to regulate every aspect of life, they still found ways to survive. Their resilience in the face of such adversity is truly admirable. Now that we've seen how Roman law governed prostitution, let's focus on one of the most intriguing and surprising aspects of Roman sex work: the role of public perception. While Roman society was, in many ways, open and practical about sex, prostitutes still faced judgment and discrimination. This perception wasn't just confined to the lower classes. Even those who worked in the most elite brothels were often seen as socially inferior. But at the same time, prostitutes were paradoxically admired by specific segments of society, especially when they held influence over powerful men. This fact adds a layer of complexity to our understanding of Roman society. In the eyes of many, prostitution was a necessary evil, an unavoidable part of Roman society that helped maintain order and stability. The men who used prostitutes were seen as simply fulfilling their natural desires. Many Roman men, from enslaved people to emperors, were expected to visit brothels. Sexual indulgence was not just tolerated, it was a part of public life. Prostitutes, especially those working in high-end brothels, could become a symbol of social status. But despite their social utility, they were still marginalized, their very nature viewed as something lowly, something to be hidden from respectable society. This social stigma didn't just affect the women in brothels, it also influenced how prostitutes were represented in Roman art and literature. Prostitution, in a way, became an invisible part of Roman culture. It was an open secret, something that everyone knew existed but rarely discussed in polite society. Prostitutes were often depicted in Roman art as seductive figures, alluring yet dangerous. They were celebrated in some circles, but their existence was also downplayed in the broader narrative of Roman civilization. Yet, there were moments when these women captured the public's imagination in a way that transcended their status as mere sex workers. Some of the most famous courtesans of ancient Rome became legends in their own right. Women like Clodia Metelli, a courtesan and member of the Roman elite, utilized their beauty, intellect, and social connections to navigate the power dynamics of the time. These women weren't just sexual objects. They were influencers in their own right, shaping the politics and culture of Rome with their charm and wit, a fact that underscores the significant impact of their role in Roman society. But even these high-status courtesans weren't immune to the stigma attached to prostitution. No matter how influential they became, they still carried the mark of their profession. While some Roman men admired them for their beauty and wit, others saw them as morally compromised. In Roman society, even the most powerful women who worked as prostitutes had to navigate a double standard. They were simultaneously revered and reviled. This strange contradiction reflected the broader tension in Roman society, where sex and power were constantly in a state of flux. Public perception of prostitution also fluctuated depending on the political climate of the time. During periods of moral or religious reform, such as under the reign of Augustus, prostitution was harshly criticized. Augustus, in particular, attempted to regulate Roman society in a way that emphasized moral purity. His laws, like the Lex Julia, were aimed at controlling sexual behavior and preserving the dignity of the Roman family. These laws placed heavy restrictions on sexual conduct, especially for women. Prostitutes, during these times, were seen as a threat to the moral fabric of Roman society, and they were harshly punished or ostracized. Augustus's moral laws were designed to strengthen the Roman family, but they also made life harder for prostitutes, forcing them to work in more secretive or hidden environments. On the other hand, during times of political stability or excess, such as during the reigns of emperors like Nero or Caligula, prostitution could be seen as a natural extension of Roman indulgence. Lavish banquets, excess, and a general disregard for traditional values marked these periods. During these times, prostitution was often celebrated as a symbol of Roman decadence. The emperor and the elite used prostitutes as a form of entertainment, and the brothels were places where power and pleasure mingled. In these moments, prostitutes could enjoy a temporary elevation in status, as they became a part of the larger political theater. This ever-changing view of prostitution reflects the complexities of Roman social life. Prostitutes were not just objects of desire. They were also participants in the broader Roman power structure. They had to navigate the complex web of social expectations, legal restrictions, and personal desires. Some women managed to carve out powerful positions within this system, becoming influencers, confidants, and even partners to some of the most powerful men in the empire. Others, however, were trapped by the very system that gave them a role in society, their lives marked by poverty, exploitation, and lack of agency. But no matter where they fit in the social hierarchy, Roman prostitutes all shared one thing in common. They were a part of a system that commodified their bodies. They were valued not for their intelligence or character, but for their ability to fulfill a physical need. This systemic exploitation was the core of their existence. While some women managed to rise above it, the majority spent their lives working under the constant shadow of societal judgment, a reality that evokes a sense of empathy for their plight. As we drift off tonight, think about the complex role these women played in the vast Roman Empire. They were at once respected and scorned, adored and marginalized. Their bodies were both prized and disrespected. In many ways, they reflected the contradictions inherent in Roman society itself, where power, sex, and morality were constantly in a state of flux. Their story, though often overlooked, is a key piece of understanding the dynamics of ancient Rome. These women, whether at the top of the social ladder or the very bottom, shaped the empire in ways that are still felt today. Now, let's delve into one of the most intriguing, albeit often unsettling, aspects of Roman prostitution: the public spectacles that occasionally accompanied the practice. While prostitution was primarily a private affair between a client and a prostitute, there were instances when it transformed into a public event. These spectacles, often held in conjunction with Roman celebrations, festivals, and religious ceremonies, were a stark contrast to the usual discreet nature of sex work. They were an integral part of Roman entertainment, where almost every aspect of life could be turned into a form of public amusement. One of the most infamous events where prostitution played a public role was the ludi, or public games, which were often held to celebrate military victories or religious festivals. During these events, the Romans sometimes staged theatrical performances that included sexual acts, with prostitutes acting as both performers and participants. The acts were not always explicit, but they were often highly suggestive. These public displays were intended to amuse and entertain the masses while also serving a cultural purpose. They acted as a form of religious offering to the gods, specifically those associated with fertility and sexuality. Prostitution's association with public entertainment was especially evident in some of the more decadent periods of Roman history, such as the reign of Emperor Nero. Nero, infamous for his excess and indulgence, held public banquets and festivals where sexual acts were not only permitted but encouraged as part of the entertainment. prostitutes were brought in to perform for the guests, and the line between sacred religious acts and worldly pleasures was blurred. These public spectacles were often intended to amuse, but they also served as a display of wealth and power. By putting on such extravagant events, Roman emperors demonstrated their control over both the masses and the moral fabric of society. It was as though the emperors were saying, "We control what is sacred, and we control what is profane." However, it's crucial to understand that these spectacles weren't solely for the elite's benefit. Roman society was fixated on indulgence, and while the upper class had the luxury of private indulgence, the lower classes had their form of entertainment. The lower-tier brothels, where prostitutes catered to soldiers, enslaved people, and working-class men, were also places of public spectacle. These establishments were where men could gather, observe others indulge, and let loose without fear of judgment. This type of public interaction, though more private than the grand spectacles of the elite, still held a certain social power. It was a place where men could release their desires without consequence and where prostitutes, despite being marginalized, had some degree of control in this social exchange. The Roman view of sex as an entertainment, in a way, shaped how prostitution was perceived. Prostitutes were seen as a tool of public indulgence, their labor a form of service to the greater good of Roman pleasure. In some ways, this could be interpreted as a reflection of the empire's power. By making sex a public spectacle, the state ensured that its citizens were entertained, distracted, and controlled. The entertainment value of prostitution made it a regular part of Roman society, just as gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances were. These events were all mechanisms of control, tools used by the elite to maintain dominance while simultaneously placating the masses. However, there was also an undercurrent of violence and exploitation in these spectacles. The women who participated were not always there by choice. Many were forced into the role of performers in these public events. These spectacles were not about empowerment. They were a manifestation of power, control, and subjugation. The women involved were frequently coerced, their participation often a way for the state to reinforce its dominance over not just the body of the individual, but over the body of society itself. The audience attending these events was expected to enjoy the performance, but there was always a degree of humiliation inherent in the process. The public aspect of prostitution in these events reinforced the idea that women were, in the eyes of the Roman state, property. This public use of prostitution also contributes to a broader understanding of Roman sexual morality, or lack thereof. The Roman world, as intricate as it was, allowed for freedoms that would be unthinkable in many cultures. Yet this freedom came with a cost. The rules were clear. Men could enjoy the pleasures of sex without fear of scandal or consequence. But women, especially those involved in sex work, had no such luxury. They were constantly exposed to the scrutiny of the public eye. Even the women who gained status in Roman society were still viewed as inferior, and their bodies were still seen as commodities to be used, displayed, and consumed. When reflecting on these public spectacles, it's impossible to ignore the broader implications for women's autonomy in Roman society. Yes, some prostitutes found ways to rise above their circumstances and even gain influence, but they still did so within a system that devalued them. They were used as tools for entertainment, and their lives, for the most part, were spent in the shadows of Roman society. The public spectacles in which they participated were simply another manifestation of how women's bodies were controlled, commodified, and exploited for the entertainment of men. As you settle in tonight, think about the women who lived their lives on display, both in the brothels and in the grand spectacles of Roman society. They were not just the objects of sexual desire. They were the centerpieces of a system that defined Roman culture in complex and often contradictory ways. Their role in these public spectacles wasn't a choice but an imposition, a reminder that, in ancient Rome, pleasure, power, and exploitation were all intricately tied together. Let's take a step back and consider how prostitution in ancient Rome intersected with its broader social and economic systems. While much of the discussion so far has focused on the lives of the women who worked in the trade, the truth is that the existence of prostitution was inextricably linked to the very structure of Roman society itself. It wasn't just the women who were affected by this practice. Men and the state, too, were deeply invested in the functioning of the sex trade. The economy of Rome thrived on both public indulgence and private transactions, and prostitution played a role in sustaining that. Rome was a city built on the backs of enslaved people, soldiers, and laborers who worked long hours in fields, mines, and factories. For these men, the brothel was a welcome escape from the hardships of their daily lives. For some, it was the only way to relieve the tension that came with working in a brutal, physically demanding environment. But for others, the brothel was more than just a place to find temporary pleasure. It was also a symbol of Roman civilization itself. The Roman elite knew that the power of their empire depended on keeping the masses content and distracted. Entertainment, in whatever form, was a tool used to maintain peace and control. Prostitution, as a form of public entertainment, was often used to reinforce the idea that the Roman state had everything under control. The existence of brothels, clean, well-regulated establishments, suggested that the government was managing the most taboo aspects of life. Even though sex work was viewed as something morally questionable, its regulation meant that it was kept out of sight from the more respectable parts of society. Brothels had their place in the Roman world. They were seen as an unfortunate necessity that helped maintain social harmony. But the reality of Roman prostitution was far more complex than simply being a business. Many of the women who worked in brothels or as independent prostitutes weren't just trying to make a living. They were doing so because they had no other choice. For some, it was the only job they could find, especially if they had no family to support them. Others had been born into it, either as enslaved people or as the daughters of low-income families. The lack of a safety net meant that many of these women had little to no recourse if their lives took a turn for the worse. Economically speaking, prostitution served as a form of social safety net in a world where resources were scarce. For many men, it was a release from the pressures of Roman life. But for women, prostitution was a form of economic necessity. Without it, many would have been left to fend for themselves in a city that offered few opportunities for women to work in respectable roles. Even though the state heavily regulated prostitution, it was a system that ultimately exploited the most vulnerable members of Roman society. In some ways, prostitution was also an economic engine for the broader Roman world. The brothels and the sex trade were big business, and the taxes generated from these establishments helped fund the infrastructure of the empire. The Roman government relied on these taxes to maintain roads, build aqueducts, and sustain the military. Even in an era as decadent and morally complex as the Roman Empire, sex work was a way for the state to ensure its survival. But let's not romanticize this situation too much. While prostitution may have been profitable for the Roman state, it was rarely profitable for the women involved. Many were trapped in a system that offered little hope for escape. Even though some were able to buy their freedom, most prostitutes had no way out. They worked tirelessly, and their bodies were commodified for the pleasure of others. The idea of a better life was, for most of these women, an illusion, especially for those who were enslaved or in lower-tier brothels. There was also a significant racial element in the world of Roman prostitution. Enslaved people were often captured from conquered territories, and many of them were forced into prostitution. These women were usually seen as exotic, and their bodies were exploited as a form of entertainment. The desire for exotic women from foreign lands was prevalent among the Roman elite, reflecting the Roman Empire's imperialistic tendencies. Just as Roman men would conquer lands and enslave people, they would also claim foreign women, using their bodies as trophies of Roman power. This dynamic of conquest, control, and exploitation was central to the experience of many women in the sex trade. Despite the oppressive nature of the system, the women in the sex trade found ways to assert their agency. Those in high-class brothels and independent women were able to influence their clients, negotiate prices, and even set terms. While the societal norms circumscribed their autonomy, these women managed to exert control over their bodies and, to some extent, their lives. Despite the overwhelming inequalities and hardships, some women not only survived but also thrived in the Roman sex trade. Some used their earnings to buy their freedom, while others formed influential relationships with wealthy men, thereby gaining social influence. The most successful courtesans even became influential figures in Roman politics, using their connections to influence decisions and amass wealth. These stories of resilience and success in the face of adversity can inspire us today. When we think of the prostitutes of ancient Rome, it's easy to imagine them as victims, trapped in a system of exploitation. But the reality is much more nuanced. These women were not just passive victims. They were active participants in the social and economic fabric of the empire. They navigated a world shaped by power, class, and gender, and some found ways to rise above the limitations imposed on them. Understanding this complexity can help us empathize with their experiences. As you lie down to rest tonight, reflect on the lives of these women, the courtesans, the street prostitutes, the enslaved people. Despite the hardships they faced, they played an integral role in the Roman world. They were both victims and agents, exploited and empowered. Their stories are a reminder of the complex dynamics that shaped the Roman Empire, a world where sex, power, and survival were intricately intertwined. As we delve deeper into the intricate world of Roman prostitution, we encounter a rich tapestry of myths and misconceptions that have shrouded the lives of these women in ancient Rome. The historical realities of Roman sex work are a complex interplay of societal norms, individual choices, and economic pressures, often overshadowed by oversimplified narratives. In contemporary culture, the image of the Roman prostitute is frequently romanticized or reduced to a straightforward narrative of exploitation. However, the truth is far more nuanced. The lives of these women were layered with experiences that defy our assumptions. One of the most persistent myths about Roman prostitutes is the idea that all prostitutes were enslaved people or poor women with no other option for survival. While many women in the sex trade were indeed enslaved or from impoverished backgrounds, some women entered the profession voluntarily or for reasons beyond necessity. Some women, especially those in the upper echelons of Roman society, may have chosen to become courtesans as a means to gain power and influence. The line between choice and coercion was often blurry, and many women in Rome saw sex work as a means to secure their autonomy or to gain wealth they wouldn't otherwise have access to. In these cases, prostitution was not solely about survival. It could also be about gaining status, independence, or even political power. Historians still debate whether some women actually chose prostitution as a career or whether it was simply the result of social and economic pressure. In Roman society, a woman's options were often limited. Most women didn't have the luxury of becoming doctors, soldiers, or politicians. For many women, prostitution offered the only route to independence, as it was one of the few ways they could earn money on their terms. However, this choice wasn't always a simple one, and it came with enormous risks. The stigma surrounding sex work made it difficult for these women to live fulfilling lives outside of the brothel. Another myth is that prostitutes were always treated poorly by Roman society. While they were often viewed as inferior and subhuman, not all Roman citizens saw prostitutes as enemies or as lesser beings. Some men, especially those who frequented high-end brothels, treated the courtesans with respect and even admiration. Many Roman men considered these women intellectual equals, capable of engaging in conversations about art, philosophy, or politics. Some of the more famous courtesans were known for their wit, beauty, and charm, which allowed them to rise to positions of influence in Roman society. One famous example is Claudia Metelli, a member of the Roman elite who was also a well-known courtesan. Claudia used her position to influence powerful men and even became involved in political matters. Her story is a reminder that not all women in the trade were passive victims. Some were able to use their position to gain real influence and power. The myth that all Roman prostitutes were powerless is not true. Many, especially those who worked in the upper-class brothels, were in control of their own lives and used their beauty and intelligence as a means of self-promotion. However, despite the respect and admiration that some courtesans enjoyed, the majority of prostitutes in ancient Rome were still marginalized. They were seen as necessary but not respectable. The law might have regulated their profession, but society's moral values still deemed them unworthy of full respect. Even high-status courtesans were often labeled as fallen women, a stark contradiction to the complex lives they led. These contradictions in Roman attitudes toward prostitution reflect the tension between the empire's desire to maintain control over the sexual lives of its citizens and its indulgence in excess and hedonism. It's a reflection that invites us to ponder the societal norms and moral values that shaped the lives of these women. Another common misconception is that Roman prostitutes were always anonymous and faceless figures, with no sense of individuality or personal identity. In reality, many prostitutes had names, reputations, and even their following. Some courtesans became famous for their beauty, intelligence, and charm, and their names were well known throughout Rome. These women were seen as celebrities of their time, and their names were immortalized in poetry, art, and literature. The most famous courtesans were often sought after not just for their sexual services, but for their ability to engage in intellectual and artistic pursuits. The poet Ovid, for example, wrote about the beauty and charm of some of Rome's most famous courtesans in his Ars Amatoria, a guide on love and seduction. He described the courtesans of Rome not as mere objects of desire, but as complex women who wielded significant influence. In Ovid's view, courtesans were skilled in the art of love, capable of engaging with men on a level that went beyond the physical. They could charm, seduce, and win over even the most powerful of men. Ovid's portrayal of these women is one of respect and admiration, and it contrasts sharply with the negative image of prostitutes in later works. Yet, despite the admiration some courtesans received, they were still bound by the social structure of Roman society. The stigma of being a prostitute was challenging to overcome. Even women who managed to climb the social ladder could not escape the judgment that came with their profession. The society that allowed prostitution to thrive also condemned it, creating a tension that existed throughout the empire. This paradox reflects the broader moral and social contradictions in Rome, where the same state that allowed for such indulgence also demanded purity, virtue, and restraint. As you reflect on the myths and realities that surrounded the lives of Roman prostitutes, consider the resilience and agency that defined their existence. These women, often misunderstood and vilified for their work, navigated a world where they were both celebrated and stigmatized. They leveraged their position to gain agency in a society that offered them few opportunities. Their stories are far more than tales of victimhood. They are stories of resilience, survival, and, sometimes, triumph. Their ability to carve out a space for themselves in a society that often condemned them is a testament to their resilience and should serve as a source of inspiration. Let's now shift focus to the decline of prostitution in the Roman Empire, particularly how it evolved during the empire's fall. While prostitution had long been an accepted part of Roman society, it began to face increasing criticism as the empire entered its later stages. The decline of prostitution wasn't just about moral or social changes. It also reflected more profound political and economic shifts that changed the very fabric of Roman life. The rise of prostitution in the Roman Empire was a response to the social and economic conditions of the time, with poverty, gender inequality, and the lack of other employment opportunities driving many women into the sex trade. As the empire weakened, so too did the complex systems that had sustained the sex trade. The rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire played a significant role in this shift. Christianity, which became the dominant religion during the reign of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, introduced new moral and social expectations. Christian teachings about sexual morality stood in stark contrast to the Roman tolerance of prostitution. Christianity emphasized chastity, modesty, and the sanctity of marriage, and it began to view prostitution as a moral evil. As the Christian church grew in influence, It condemned prostitution as sinful and detrimental to society's moral fabric. This moral shift didn't happen overnight, but over several centuries. With the rise of Christian leaders and religious authorities, laws and practices regarding sex work became stricter. The church began to advocate for the rehabilitation of prostitutes, promoting their conversion to a life of piety and chastity. Some bishops and religious figures even advocated for the rehabilitation of former prostitutes, offering them shelter and support to leave the sex trade. But despite these efforts, prostitutes found it difficult to reintegrate into society. Many of them were marked for life by their former work, and society's negative view of them did not disappear just because the church had more power. However, it wasn't just the influence of Christianity that changed the dynamics of prostitution in the empire. As the political and economic stability of Rome began to unravel, so did the systems that allowed the brothel industry to flourish. The empire was facing a financial crisis, with inflation, wars, and invasions disrupting everyday life. As the Roman economy weakened, brothels faced increased regulation and, in some areas, even closure. Many women in the sex trade were forced out of their work, unable to find clients as the empire's wealth and population dwindled. The fall of the Roman Empire also led to the decline of the Roman urban centers, where brothels and prostitution were most prevalent. As cities were sacked and economic systems broke down, the once thriving centers of sex work in places like Rome and Alexandria became less and less viable. The power of the Roman state weakened, and brothels were no longer as tightly controlled or regulated as they had once been. In many places, prostitution was driven underground, and women who had worked in brothels or on the streets found themselves without a place to go. Many of these women, often from disadvantaged backgrounds, were either forced into poverty or into other forms of labor that offered little more freedom or dignity. Their experiences, usually marked by exploitation and abuse, provide a stark contrast to the romanticized view of prostitution in ancient times. Despite the decline, the sex trade in Roman society displayed remarkable resilience. Even as the Roman Empire fractured and its traditional systems of power crumbled, the desire for sex, companionship, and pleasure persisted. While conventional forms of prostitution declined, new forms of sex work emerged, adapting to the shifting power dynamics between the old Roman world and the new Byzantine world, as well as the increasingly powerful influence of the church in regulating social behavior. The fall of the Roman Empire marked the beginning of a new chapter for sex work. As the power of the state waned, new moral codes took hold, and prostitution became less a visible part of Roman life and more an underground activity. Women involved in prostitution were increasingly seen as fallen and sinful, and they were marginalized even further in society. The writings of early Christian thinkers such as Augustine and Ambrose reveal how prostitution became associated with sin and degeneration, reflecting the lasting impact of the Roman Empire's moral shifts on the perception of prostitution. However, the story of prostitution did not end with the fall of Rome. As the Roman Empire crumbled, many of the social structures and practices that had sustained the sex trade continued to live on, albeit in a much reduced form. The sex trade adapted and evolved in new and different ways, with remnants of Roman practices surviving in many parts of Europe, even if they were reinterpreted in light of Christian morality. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the way prostitution changed throughout the Roman Empire. It began as a public, legal, and even socially accepted practice, but over time, it became increasingly stigmatized and pushed to the fringes of society. Women who worked in the sex trade were once seen as vital parts of Roman culture. Still, as the empire collapsed, they became increasingly invisible, their roles and their voices drowned out by the forces of political and religious change. Yet, despite the moral shifts, prostitution remained part of the fabric of the world, reshaping itself in response to changing times. The legacy of Roman prostitution, despite the decline of the empire, continued to influence later civilizations, particularly in the medieval and early modern periods. The collapse of the Roman Empire didn't erase the practices of the past. Instead, the systems and the societal understanding of sex work evolved, adapting to the new social, political, and religious realities of Europe after the fall of Rome. In many ways, the early medieval period was marked by a return to a stricter, more conservative view of sexuality and the human body, heavily influenced by Christian doctrine. Yet, even as Roman laws and customs fell away, the role of prostitution in society remained a constant thread, weaving its way into the fabric of Western civilization. As the Roman Empire crumbled, it left a complicated legacy of prostitution. The shift from a more secular understanding of sex work to a Christianized, puritanical view marked a period of moral transformation. The Church, which held immense power in the post-Roman world, viewed prostitution with increasing disdain. Yet, while many Christian leaders believed prostitution to be a sin, they also recognized it as an unfortunate necessity. In fact, during the medieval period, prostitution was often allowed to persist under the guise of controlling immoral behavior. The Catholic Church itself, in specific periods, sanctioned prostitution, offering it a place within society, albeit as a necessary evil. Despite the Church's complex stance on prostitution, women who entered the sex trade in the medieval era were primarily viewed as tragic figures. The idea that prostitutes were fallen women, inherently sinful and deserving of compassion, became widespread. In the early medieval period, prostitutes were not only seen as morally corrupted but also as victims. The perception of prostitution as a vice that could be contained within a controlled framework became the new narrative. In some cases, brothels were even placed under the authority of religious institutions, controlled by the Church as a way of managing and limiting sexual immorality. These shifts in societal attitudes reflected the changing role of women in Western society. Where Roman prostitutes might have enjoyed a certain level of power, especially those in high-status brothels, medieval women involved in sex work faced an entirely different set of restrictions. Despite these challenges, women who had once enjoyed some degree of autonomy now found themselves bound by the moral codes of Christianity, often facing harsh judgment from the Church and the public. Prostitutes were treated not just as workers but as embodiments of sin and moral failure. They were marked as fallen, and that stigma would persist in many forms for centuries to come. Yet, in the face of these societal changes, women in the sex trade showed remarkable resilience and strength, a testament to the human spirit in the most challenging of circumstances. The remnants of Roman prostitution also influenced the legal systems of the medieval period. In some ways, medieval laws regarding prostitution mirrored the Roman approach, in that sex work was regulated but not outlawed. In medieval Europe, brothels were often officially recognized by local authorities, who placed restrictions on the locations and the types of services offered. While the laws of Rome focused on controlling sex work for the sake of public order and taxes, medieval laws were more concerned with containing sexual immorality. In both cases, however, the regulations were primarily designed to maintain control over a potentially disruptive element of society. The significant difference was that in medieval times, prostitution came to be viewed mainly through a religious and moral lens, rather than simply a civic issue. As we turn to the modern world, the legacy of Roman prostitution continues to echo through the ages. The transition from the Roman Empire to the medieval period may have altered the perception of prostitution, but it didn't eliminate the practice. Prostitutes continued to be marginalized, and their role in society continued to be regulated. The Roman view of prostitution as a necessary but morally dubious institution was replaced by the medieval perspective that it was a vice to be contained and controlled. Efforts to suppress and regulate prostitution included the establishment of laws, the control of brothels, and the imposition of social stigma. But despite these efforts, it persisted, just as it had in ancient Rome. As you settle in tonight, reflect on how the legacy of Roman prostitution has shaped the way we view sex work today. While the systems have evolved and the laws have changed, some of the attitudes prevalent in ancient Rome have remained remarkably consistent. The exploitation of women in the sex trade, the moral contradictions surrounding prostitution, and the complex relationships between sex, power, and society are issues that continue to be relevant. And while the specifics of Roman prostitution may be lost to history, the enduring nature of these societal attitudes towards sex work is a point of reflection. The themes of control, exploitation, and survival persist as integral parts of the human experience. These women, whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, still echo through the centuries, reminding us of the deep roots of the struggle for agency, dignity, and respect. As we reach the final section of our journey through the complex world of Roman prostitution, let's take a step back and reflect on how these women and their lives continue to influence our understanding of ancient Rome. Prostitution in ancient Rome, with its contradictions and complexity, offers a window into the broader issues of power, gender, and society that were prevalent in the Roman Empire, and indeed continue to echo through history. The societal implications of Roman prostitution are profound, shaping not only the lives of these women but also the very fabric of ancient Roman society. The lives of Roman prostitutes were shaped by a system that simultaneously commodified their bodies and granted them a strange form of agency. While many of these women were forced into the trade by circumstances beyond their control, others used their status as prostitutes to gain power, influence, and wealth. This duality of victimhood and power is what makes the story of Roman prostitution so fascinating. These women, whether enslaved people or courtesans, could exert control over their clients and even shape the political landscape of the empire. At the same time, they were often trapped by the very system they navigated. Their resilience in such a challenging system is genuinely inspiring. The fascinating complexity of prostitution in ancient Rome lies in its role as both a necessary social institution and a deeply marginalized profession. It was regulated by law and acknowledged in the public sphere, and yet still stigmatized and controlled. The Roman state recognized the necessity of prostitution, but the very fact that it was so tightly regulated shows how much anxiety it caused within Roman society. The state's desire to control the behavior of its citizens, both in terms of sexual activity and moral conduct, was a constant balancing act. The legal frameworks put in place to regulate prostitution were as much about managing social order as they were about generating income for the empire. In examining the role of prostitutes in Roman society, we also gain insight into the broader role of women in the empire. The women who worked in brothels were often marginalized, regarded as lower-class citizens, and seen as morally corrupt. Yet, Roman prostitutes also served as symbols of both vice and vitality, two aspects of Roman life that were equally celebrated. Prostitutes could serve as a means of social control, providing a space where the desires of the Roman population could be freely indulged. But at the same time, they were constantly at the mercy of their clients, their owners, and society's shifting moral values. It is also essential to recognize how the Roman Empire's vast reach influenced the practice of prostitution. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean and beyond, the dynamics of sex work also shifted. Roman soldiers, merchants, and officials would often come into contact with local women in the territories they conquered, and the practice of prostitution spread with them. In some areas, local women were enslaved and brought into brothels. In other words, women from the local communities joined the trade as a way to support their families. Prostitution, thus, became not only an integral part of Roman society, but also a practice that crossed cultural boundaries, bringing different traditions of sex work together in ways that shaped the empire's multicultural fabric. The cultural diversity of Roman prostitution is a testament to its far-reaching influence. Historians still debate the extent to which prostitution in Roman society was voluntary or coerced. Was prostitution, especially among lower-class women, a choice or a means of survival? Could some women, like the courtesans, use their position in the sex trade to gain power? Or were they playing a role assigned to them by a patriarchal system? The answer is likely a mix of both. For some, prostitution may have been a calculated decision, a way to gain power or wealth in a world where their options were limited. For others, it was a fate they had no control over, forced upon them by their circumstances. These women lived within the tight boundaries of Roman society, but some still managed to carve out a sense of agency in their lives, even in such an oppressive system. As we consider the lasting impact of Roman prostitution, we also have to ask, how did these women shape Roman culture? While their role in the empire may have been marginalized, they were still crucial players in the larger societal system. Prostitutes were sources of income, sources of pleasure, and even sources of political influence. They entertained men of power and helped maintain social order. They were both part of the moral landscape and a direct challenge to it. They embodied the contradictions of Roman society, open and indulgent in some ways, yet judgmental and moralistic in others. Finally, as you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the legacy of these women within the broader context of history. The history of prostitution in Rome is a history of survival, of agency within a system designed to deny women any real power. It is a story that is both tragic and empowering. Tragic because many of these women were exploited and marginalized, but empowering because, in some cases, they managed to defy the odds, rise above their circumstances, and shape their world. The world of Roman prostitutes is a world of contradiction. A world where power and exploitation, beauty and suffering, and freedom and oppression coexisted in the same space. While these women were often written out of history or reduced to simple caricatures, their stories are essential, and they deserve to be remembered. In their lives, we see reflections of the struggles faced by many women throughout history, the fight for agency, dignity, and recognition. And as you drift into sleep, remember the complexities of their existence, how their lives intertwined with those of emperors, soldiers, philosophers, and poets, and how they continue to resonate with us today.